Okay, you guys, Ms. Shapiro's here. I already tried to record this once and it didn't work, so I'm annoyed. But we're going to talk a little bit about biogeochemical cycles. I think this is video like 3 out of the 4 that you asked. So I'm going to go through mostly the nitrogen cycle, but I'm going to touch briefly on the other cycles. Remember that we need to have the cycles because the Earth is a closed system for matter. So that means that no matter is entering or leaving the Earth. And so everything just constantly has to be transferred and transformed. Remember, we call that the law of conservation of matter, that that matter is neither created or destroyed, it's only transferred. So we just have to move it around in different places. So if we take a look at the water cycle, I know that this is one that you guys know. Um, just a couple of reminders for the things at the AP level that we have this evaporation from the soil and evaporation from plant leaves. We call that transpiration, and combined you might see it as evapotranspiration. That we have this percolation or infiltration here through the rocks, and that's what's going to fill up our aquifer. If we take too much water out of this aquifer, and this body of water here is like the ocean, not like inland, like here in Colorado, but it's on the coast, say, like in California or in South Carolina. This water will start to move into our aquifer, and we call that saltwater intrusion. And that's one of the many ways that humans impact the water cycle. The main way that we impact the water cycle is through drawing more out of our aquifer than can possibly be replenished, or what we call recharged. And the majority of the time, we're removing that water for agriculture. And then the second way is through the clearing of land. So anytime you pull plants out, their roots are no longer holding that soil in place, and that soil runs off or erodes off into the waterways. And we see that soil is darkly colored. It absorbs sunlight. That causes temperatures to go up, which causes dissolved oxygen levels to go down. And then obviously by polluting it, by putting things like fertilizer or oil into it, or even trash. Next up is the carbon cycle. You guys don't forget, there's just a couple of big parts of the carbon cycle. The first one is that animals respire. So you guys were putting carbon dioxide out into the atmosphere, and then things like bacteria or phytoplankton in the ocean, as well as plants, are taking that in. Notice that these numbers, 120 and 90, are slightly bigger than the ones that are coming out. And so what we see that these are sinks. So we see huge carbon sinks here in the forests. We also see that these photosynthetic organisms that are here in the ocean are going to die. They're going to sink to the bottom. That's going to be compressed and cemented down and made into sedimentary rock. The big thing is that if we go back one picture, so here you see the sedimentary rock being made. Sometimes this decomposition happens very rapidly and we get out fossil fuels. And so humans impact this cycle when we burn fossil fuels, right? So it's not really a normal process. Respiring is pretty normal, right? Lions do that, elephants do that, but they do not use fossil fuels. So that's the main way that humans are impacting the carbon cycle, along with deforestation. So anytime you're taking those trees out, they're no longer able to take in carbon, and therefore that's impacting the carbon cycle. Next up, I really want to talk about the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle is super important. It's the one you need to know in detail. So the carbon cycle, or the nitrogen cycle, starts in the atmosphere. That's our sink for nitrogen. It's our reservoir where we're spending the most of our time. And that's in the form of N2. But that's not something that plants can take in. There's a special type of bacteria that lives in legume plants called rhizobium, and it is able to take in the N2, but no other plants can. So we need to convert that nitrogen into being nitrate, which is the form that plants use. And you can remember that because they ate it, nitrate. And so what will happen is this happens in 2 different ways. A small percentage is converted via abiotic fixation or inorganic nitrogen fixation, and that's done by lightning, and that converts it into ammonia in the soil, and you can see that with this arrow right here. But the majority of nitrogen is converted into nitrates via biological nitrogen fixation, and so that's nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they convert that N2 that's in the atmosphere into ammonia or into ammonium. Ammonium is the ion form. From there, it's still not usable to plants. So it has to go through a process called nitrification, and that's done by nitrifying bacteria. And that converts it first into nitrite, ITE, nitrite, which is not on this diagram, and then eventually into nitrate. And you can remember that plants use that because that's what they ate, and that's NO3. So plants will take that in, they'll do what we call assimilation, and they'll convert it. Remember that we need nitrogen for our protein and we need it for DNA. And so plants will take it up out of the soil, they ate it, and go through assimilation. And then plants are eaten by animals. Both organisms die, they go through decomposition, animals poop, and that those decomposers do a fancy process called ammonification. It's really decomposition. And that ammonification converts the nitrogen that's in the body of the organism into ammonia and ammonium, and the cycle can continue. And so that ammonification process is done by decomposers. And that's really, really, really important, things like bacteria and fungi, because if they weren't present, then all of this nitrate would, or nitrogen would build up in the organisms and it wouldn't be available for new organisms. Some of the nitrate does go through a process called denitrification, and it's done by denitrifying bacteria, and it converts that nitrogen back into N2 to complete the cycle. You can use the acronym FIXNAD to help you remember. So nitrogen fixation creates ammonia, and then we go through nitrification to convert that into nitrite and then nitrate. Plants do assimilation to make it into proteins, and then they die. They go through ammonification to make ammonium, and again, that ammonium would then be used for nitrification to get into nitrate, and then would go through denitrification to give you nitrogen again. Humans impact this cycle by doing excessive amounts, raising in excessive amounts of nitrogen fixing crops such as corn for ethanol or livestock. We add nitrogen into the atmosphere anytime we burn fossil fuels, and that contributes to acid rain. But overwhelmingly, the impacts that humans have are that we take this nitrogen out of the ground, we put it through a process called the Haber-Bosch process. I think that's how you say it. Haber-Bosch process, which was created in World War II, and we create synthetic fertilizers, and then we put those fertilizers on our crops, and then the plants really need the nitrogen, and so they grow really fast, but some of that fertilizer runs off, like if it rains, will run off into a water source, and that ultimately causes the dissolved oxygen levels to decline, and therefore all your fish die. The last cycle that I'm going to go over very briefly is the phosphorus cycle. This one does not have an atmospheric component. It's pretty easy. It follows the water cycle. So we see that phosphorus is present in rocks. This is a cycle that takes a really long time. The nitrogen cycle is very speedy. The water cycle is very speedy, but carbon and phosphorus are very slow. And that's because they both involve rock. And so what we see is the phosphate is present in the rock, that undergoes weathering and erosion, and that phosphorus becomes present in the soil. Plants assimilate that phosphorus and use it for their DNA. Then it gets taken up into animals, and then they both die. Decomposers return it to the soil. And from there, two things happen. It's either taken up by animals again, or some of that will run off into the oceans. Phosphorus doesn't stay dissolved in the water very well, so it precipitates or becomes a solid again and falls to the bottom, where it's compressed and solidified again into rock at the bottom of the ocean floor. And then when that rock becomes exposed and weathered again, then it enters the cycle again. But it spends lots and lots of times, like millions of years, in that phosphorus, in that rock cycle. Humans impact the rock cycle, again, by using it in fertilizer. So fertilizer contains three components, N, P, K. We've talked about the nitrogen cycle. We've talked about the phosphorus cycle. The other one is potassium or potash. We don't need to know that cycle for this class. But what you'll see is that both nitrogen and phosphorus are required by plants, so that's what we find in fertilizer. Think back to your soil lab, you tested for N and P and K. And so what happens is when this fertilizer enters into the water, the plants get really excited because it's fertilizer, and then they grow, and then there's another series of steps. And ultimately the end result is that all of the oxygen gets depleted out of the water. And that causes fish and other organisms to die because they need oxygen. So, this is the sulfur cycle. You don't need to know that one. So I hope that this was helpful. I believe this is topics maybe 1.456 and 7. So let me know if you have any questions.